I'm sitting in my corner office on the 14th floor, looking out at the Atlanta skyline, and I still catch myself thinking about the parking lot of a Waffle House on Piedmont Avenue where I slept in my car for 11 days straight. That was 4 years ago. I was 61 years old and I had nothing, not a bank account, not a key to a home, not a single person who believed me. My name is Harriet Okafor, and for 3 years my only daughter believed I had stolen from her. I need you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. I am not someone who cries easily. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, in a house where my mother said crying was something you did in the shower, so nobody had to carry your pain with them to work. I carried that with me my whole life. I raised my daughter the same way. Chin up, move forward. Fix what you can fix. What happened to me couldn't be fixed, not for a long time. I worked in commercial real estate for 31 years. Started as an administrative assistant at a mid-sized brokerage in Atlanta called Whitmore & Associates when I was 27. By the time I was 45, I was a senior acquisitions manager. I knew this city the way a surgeon knows a body. Which neighborhoods were about to turn, which blocks were worth more than anyone realized yet, which developers were overextended and which ones were quietly building empires. That knowledge was the only inheritance I had to give my daughter. Her name is Simone. She came into this world when I was 32, during the worst thunderstorm Atlanta had seen in a decade. And from the moment the nurse put her in my arms, I understood that everything I built from then on was for her. Her father left when she was 4. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I did for a long time, but that particular door closed somewhere around my 55th birthday, and I stopped spending energy on it. What mattered was that I raised Simone alone, worked double hours alone, sat at every school play and every graduation alone. And I did it without complaint because she was worth every single bit of it. By the time Simone was in her late 20s, she had a real estate license of her own. She was sharp. She had my instincts and her father's charm, which is a dangerous combination in this business. We started talking about going into business together. I had the capital. I had the relationships. She had the energy and the hunger. We drew up a plan. A boutique development firm focused on mixed-use properties in underserved Atlanta neighborhoods. I put in $420,000, everything I had saved since her father left. We called it Simone and Harriet Development, LLC. She laughed when I insisted her name come first. My brother-in-law introduced us to a man named Wesley Tate. Wesley was a contractor. 50 years old, easy smile, always showed up in a pressed shirt and good shoes. He had done work for my sister's husband on a commercial renovation in Buckhead, and they spoke highly of him. Wesley had a portfolio, references, a website, the whole picture. We hired him to manage the construction phase of our first project, a 12-unit mixed-use building in the West End. I want to tell you there was a moment where something felt wrong, and I ignored it. That would make a cleaner story. But there wasn't. Wesley was professional. He communicated well. The project started on time. The problem was in the accounts. Our business had a joint operating account. Both Simone and I had access. We also had a project account specifically for the West End build, and that account flowed through the company. 6 months in, I noticed a discrepancy. $52,000 had moved out of the project account in 3 transfers. The memo said equipment deposits. I had not authorized those transfers. I brought it to Simone. She looked at the records. She went quiet in a way I hadn't seen from her since she was a teenager. Then she said something that I still hear sometimes when the room gets too quiet. She said, "Mom, these transfers were authorized from your login." I told her that was impossible. I told her I hadn't touched the project account in 2 weeks. She showed me the timestamps. She showed me the IP address. It matched my home network. I felt the floor shift under me. I called Wesley. He didn't answer. I drove to the job site the next morning. The crew was there, but Wesley was not. I called 3 more times over the next 2 days. On the 3rd day, his number was disconnected. I contacted the references he had provided, and 2 of them told me they had never heard of a Wesley Tate. The 3rd number rang endlessly. By the time we filed a police report, Wesley had vanished. And by that time, Simone had spoken to a lawyer. What I did not know, what I could not have prepared myself for, was that Wesley had covered his tracks so thoroughly that the forensic trail pointed almost entirely at me. He had found a way into my laptop remotely, almost certainly through a phishing email I had opened without thinking. He had mirrored my credentials, accessed the account from a device that routed through my home IP, and he had spent months making small, unremarkable transfers that looked like ordinary business expenses until they added up to something catastrophic. The total, by the time it was audited, was $214,000. That was my daughter's share, the money I had put in on her behalf. Gone. Simone's lawyer sent me a letter, a formal letter to my home address from an attorney I had never met, informing me that my daughter was pursuing civil action against me for misappropriation of business funds. I sat at my kitchen table and I read that letter 4 times. Then I folded it carefully, put it back in the envelope, and I sat there for a very long time without moving. My daughter thought I had stolen from her. The civil case dragged on for 14 months. I hired my own attorney, a woman named It Doesn't Matter. What matters is that I spent everything fighting it. The legal fees alone consumed my savings. I had to sell my car. I had to surrender my condo when the mortgage became something I could no longer manage, and the bank wasn't willing to work with me while I was in active litigation. I moved into a room I rented from a church deacon in East Point. Then the room became unavailable, and I spent 11 nights in a used Hyundai Sonata I had bought for $3,200 cash from a lot on Moreland Avenue. The Waffle House on Piedmont was open all night. The staff let me sit for hours if I bought coffee. I am still, to this day, a generous tipper at that location. Simone did not speak to me during the entire litigation period. When the case finally settled, not in her favor because the forensic evidence ultimately confirmed the external breach, she did not call to apologize. She did not call at all. I heard through my sister that Simone believed the technical findings were manipulated, that she had talked herself into a version of events where her mother had hired someone to cover her tracks. When my sister relayed this to me sitting in her kitchen in Decatur, I felt something close inside me. Not anger. It was more like a door quietly shutting, the kind of sound that means something has changed permanently. I was 62 years old, legally cleared, financially destroyed, estranged from my daughter, and sleeping on my sister's pull-out sofa. I want to skip forward past the dark part because I have told this story enough times in my own head, and the dark part is not what I want to give you. What I will say is that I spent approximately 4 months in a state I am not proud of. I barely ate. I watched a lot of television that I cannot tell you anything about because none of it registered. I went to church not because I was feeling faithful, but because it was warm and quiet and nobody asked me anything. The thing that pulled me back was a phone call from a former colleague named, I'll call her my old friend from Whitmore. She had heard what happened, the broad strokes anyway, and she asked if I wanted to consult on a deal she was working. Not employed, not officially, just consult, use my brain, get out of the apartment. I said yes. That one yes changed everything. The deal was a small thing, a strip mall acquisition in Smyrna that needed someone who understood the tenant mix of that particular corridor. I knew that corridor better than anyone in the city. I wrote a 12-page analysis over a weekend. My old friend used it to close the deal, and she paid me a consulting fee of $8,000. It was the first money I had earned in almost 2 years. I want to tell you that I cried. I didn't. I sat in my sister's kitchen, looked at the direct deposit notification on my phone, and I said out loud to nobody, "All right, there it is." I went back to work, not for someone else, for myself. I filed for a new LLC. I called it HR Advisory Group. I had no office, no staff, no equipment beyond a laptop and a phone. I worked from my sister's kitchen table for 6 months. I reached out to every professional contact I had cultivated in 31 years, people who knew my track record, people who had done deals with me when I was at Whitmore, people who had heard my name enough times to trust it without a letterhead. Inside of 18 months, I had 3 retained clients. Inside of 3 years, I had 22. The firm had 4 employees and a proper office in Midtown. We specialized in acquisition strategy for mixed-use development in southeastern metro markets. I was, by the time the phone call came, more financially stable than I had been at any point in my career, including the years before any of this happened. The phone call came from Simone's assistant, not from Simone. From her assistant, a young woman who introduced herself professionally and informed me, in practiced business tones, that my daughter would like me to attend the launch event for her new firm, that Simone had built a development company on her own, had secured funding for a significant commercial project in Old Fourth Ward, and was hosting a formal launch reception at the Biltmore Ballroom in downtown Atlanta. The young woman said my daughter wanted family present for the milestone. I thanked her and said I would consider it. I set my phone down on my desk. My assistant, my actual assistant, a very competent young man who had been with me since the beginning, knocked on the glass, and I told him I needed 10 minutes. He nodded and left. I turned my chair toward the window. Atlanta was doing what Atlanta does in early October, light falling gold through office glass, the city looking more forgiving from a distance than it actually is. I thought about the letter from the lawyer, the one I had folded and put back in the envelope at my kitchen table. I thought about 11 nights in a sonata on Piedmont. I thought about my daughter's voice the last time we had spoken, which was in a mediator's office, and the way she looked at me then, like she was looking at a stranger wearing her mother's face. I went. I need to explain something about why I went, and it is not a simple answer. Part of it was that I loved my daughter despite everything. Part of it was that I had done nothing wrong, and I had never stopped knowing that, even in the worst months. Part of it, and I am honest enough to admit this, was that I was not going to let that event be the version of me my daughter carried going forward. If she had invited me thinking I would show up diminished, thinking the last image she had of me would be the one from the mediator's office, she was going to be surprised. I booked a car. A black Cadillac Escalade, full size, with a driver who arrived in a suit, not because I needed anyone to see it, because I needed to arrive feeling exactly like who I had worked to become. The Biltmore Ballroom was full. Simone had done well for herself. I could see that the moment I walked in. The room was beautiful, well organized, the kind of event that signals a real business behind it rather than ambition outpacing resources. There were investors, architects, city council members. She had built something real. I wore charcoal grey. Understated. I had my business cards in my jacket pocket. I came in through the main entrance. I wasn't trying to make an entrance, but the room was configured so that the main doors opened to a sight line across the entire space, and I walked in and the 3 people nearest the door went quiet in a way that ripples. You know how that works, the way silence can travel. By the time I was 20 feet into the room, there was a pocket of stillness around me. Simone saw me from across the room. I watched her face. I have her face memorized, the way only mothers know the faces of their children, and I watched it do 4 things in approximately 4 seconds. Surprise, recognition, confusion about what she expected versus what she was seeing. And then something else, something underneath all of those, that I recognized even at this distance. She crossed the room toward me. I stood still and let her come. When she reached me, she said, "You came." I said, "You invited me." She looked at me for a long time. The room was still doing that quiet thing around us. She looked at my face and then at something behind me, possibly the entrance I had come through, and then back at my face. And I saw it happen. The arithmetic of the last 4 years running through her in real time. What her mother looked like the last time she saw her, and what her mother looked like now. She said, "Mum." I said, "I know." We did not have the conversation that night. That was not the place or the time, and we were both practical women who understood that. But I stayed for the entire event. I met her investors. I spoke to 2 city council members who had been in the industry long enough to know my name without introduction. At one point, I heard Simon say to someone, "That's my mother." She runs H. Okafor Advisory. The way she said it told me what I needed to know. Before I left, I found her near the bar. I took a business card from my pocket. I set it on the table beside her drink. I said, "When you're ready, I'm not hard to reach." She picked it up. She held it in both hands the way people hold something they are not yet sure what to do with. I said good night and I left. She called 3 weeks later, not the assistant, her. We met at a restaurant in Decatur, the kind of place with booths and low lighting, somewhere neither of us would have to perform. She was 20 minutes early. I know because the hostess told me when she seated me at a table where my daughter was already sitting, hands wrapped around a water glass. She had done her own investigation. I did not know this until she told me. She had hired someone, a private firm, 2 years after the civil case closed, because something had never sat right with her about the timeline. They had found Wesley Tate. He was in Charlotte, operating under a variation of his name, and he had done something nearly identical to a small architecture firm there 18 months after he disappeared from Atlanta. The Charlotte firm had reported him, and there was now an active fraud case in Mecklenburg County. Simone's investigator had documented everything. She slid a folder across the table. "I did not open it," she said. "I know what I did." I said, "Tell me." She looked at her water glass. Then she looked at me. She said she had wanted to me. She said she had wanted to be right more than she had wanted the truth. That when the technical evidence came back clearing me, she had found reasons not to believe it, because believing it meant she had done something unforgivable to her own mother, and it was easier to keep believing I was guilty than to sit with what it meant that I wasn't. I listened to all of it without interrupting. When she was done, I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "I need you to understand that I am not going to spend the rest of my life making you pay for this. That is not who I am. But I also need you to understand that things cannot simply go back to what they were, because what they were included you being capable of this. So we are going to build something different, slower, more honest. And we are going to do it because you are my daughter, and that has never stopped being true," she cried. I handed her a napkin. I did not cry until I was in the car on the way home. Wesley Tate was extradited from North Carolina 8 months after that dinner. He pled guilty in Mecklenburg County to 2 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of identity theft. The Atlanta case was reopened and he pled to 2 additional counts here. He is currently serving 7 years in a federal facility. I know this because the prosecutor's office contacted me as a related victim in the Atlanta case and kept me informed throughout. There was no apology from Wesley. I didn't expect one. Some people don't have that in them, and that's their accounting to manage, not mine. As for my daughter and me, we are not where we were before any of this happened. I don't know if we will ever be. But last Thanksgiving she came to my sister's house in Decatur, and she brought her boyfriend, and she sat at the table and asked me to tell the story about the first deal I ever closed. A story she had heard probably 40 times growing up. I told it again. She laughed in the right places. Afterward, she helped me with the dishes, and for a while we just stood at the sink together without saying anything. That silence felt different than the other kind. I am 66 years old. I run a firm that I built from a laptop on a kitchen table. I have an office on the 14th floor with a window that faces the skyline. Every morning when I walk in, I think about the Waffle House on Piedmont Avenue, and I think, all right, there it is. I don't need anyone to tell me who I am. I already know. I think about Wesley Tate sometimes, not with anger, that burned off a long time ago. I think about him the way you think about a storm that took the roof off your house. You don't hate the storm, but you do think about what you built back in its place, and whether you would have built it quite so strong if the roof had never come off at all. That's the thing nobody tells you about being destroyed. It clarifies you. Every pretense, every comfort, every assumption you had about who was in your corner, all of it gets stripped down to the floor joists, and then you find out what the joists are actually made of. In my case, they held, not because I am exceptional, because I had spent 31 years building something real, and real things are harder to take than people expect. What Wesley took from me was money. What my daughter took from me, and I say this not with bitterness but with precision, was time. Those are two very different losses. Money I could rebuild. I knew how to do that. Time does not come back. The 3 years I spent estranged from Simone, the 3 years she spent believing something about me that was not true, those are gone. We do not get them. And I want to be honest about that because I think it is the part of this story that people sometimes gloss over in favor of the ending. The ending is good, I know that. But the cost was real. What I learned, and I am still learning it, is that the people who wrong us are often less interesting than the question of what we do next. Wesley made his choices, Simone made hers, and then I had to make mine. Every morning in that parking lot, every hour at that kitchen table, every phone call I almost didn't make. Those were choices too. Small ones, but they compounded the same way money compounds, the same way damage compounds. And eventually they added up to something I could stand inside of and recognize as my own life. There is a version of this story where I let the weight of it bend me into someone smaller. I have met women who went through less and came out diminished. I do not say that to judge them. Loss is not a test with a right answer. But I knew, somewhere in the part of me that my mother's voice lives, that becoming smaller was not going to bring my daughter back, was not going to restore a single dollar, was not going to do anything except guarantee that Wesley Tate got more from me than the $214,000 he took. I was not going to give him that. And Simone, my daughter, who I love with a stubbornness that I cannot fully explain, she had to sit with what she had done. I could not do that work for her. What I could do was be so clearly, undeniably, unmistakably myself when she was finally ready to look, that there was no room for the story she had told herself. That is what the Biltmore Ballroom was, not revenge, not a performance, just me, fully present, refusing to be the version of her mother she had decided to remember. She did the harder work on her own, found Wesley herself, paid for the investigation herself, walked into that restaurant in Decatur and said the words out loud that took something from her that I think, in the long run, will make her a better woman than she would have been otherwise. I hope so. I am choosing to believe so. We are not fixed. Fixed is not the right word for what we are. We are honest now. We are careful with each other in a way that feels like respect rather than distance. Last Thanksgiving she stood at my sister's sink and we washed dishes together without speaking, and it was the most peaceful I had felt in years. I don't need more than that. I've learned not to need more than what's actually there.